What's up, guys? So I wanted to come on here one last time and make this final video for you guys because there's GME is at a really critical point right now in terms of trigger orientation. And so I'm going to try to explain this as best as I can. This platform is called Anemoi Predictive Technology, and it works with 4 triggers. So you have the hourly trigger, which is this purple violet line. You have the daily trigger, you have a weekly trigger, and you have a monthly trigger. You could think of this as similar to like a SMA, simple moving average, or a exponential moving average. But what's different about these triggers is that they also generate velocity. And so as price moves above and below triggers, you generate velocity that can tell you a whole lot about how the price is moving, the strength behind the move, the strength in the buyers, the strength in the sellers. There's velocity in the hour level, there's velocity on the daily level, there's weekly velocity, and there's monthly velocity as well. So the reason why I wanted to make this video is because there's also something very important, which is called trigger orientation. And so I'm going to show you guys a couple of other stocks to show you how this works. So let's take Meta, for example. And the importance of these triggers are the monthly trigger is obviously, the most important on a macro scale. The weekly trigger, the gold, is second most important. You have the daily trigger and the hourly trigger. Now, if you're trading day to day, you're scalping in, you're scalping out, then the hourly triggers, very important to use. The rule that we use is long above the hourly trigger, short below. But another way to use this platform for a longer term outlook on a stock is the trigger orientation. And so the way this works is for the most bearish setup in a stock or even an index, you would have the monthly trigger on top, which is this red line right here, followed by the weekly trigger on bottom, the daily trigger on bottom of that, and the hourly trigger on bottom of that. And you can see that when the blue trigger, this is only a 6-month chart, so you can't see it. When the blue trigger crosses below the weekly trigger, and you can see it's below here, then that puts the stock in a really bearish position. And vice versa, if the blue trigger crosses above the weekly trigger, puts the stock in a very bullish position. And so you can see here at this point where we had the daily trigger below the monthly and the weekly triggers, you could see for about 6 months in Meta, we just had really, really strong selling. And that's because with the trigger orientation tells you that this stock is in a really bearish position. And so you can expect that this trend for a nice period of time will be bearish, at least until this blue trigger over here can get back above the weekly trigger. Now there's a reason why I'm showing you this. It pertains to GME, but I'm just going to give a couple more examples. Let's look at Netflix. So you can see very similar situation in Netflix. The daily trigger, the blue line, is below the monthly and weekly triggers, and you can see just 6 months of really, really bearish price action out of Netflix. And price doesn't really turn bullish again until price can at least poke its head above the daily trigger, and the hourly trigger, the purple line, come above the daily trigger as well. This actually just happened in Netflix, I think this past week. But again, you can see based on the trigger orientation, the monthly trigger on top, the weekly trigger on bottom, the daily trigger on bottom of that, the hourly trigger on bottom of that, just how bearish the stock has been moving for, since about April, even before April. Take Microsoft, and I'm just going to give some examples to show you guys how this works. So Microsoft had the monthly trigger on bottom, so wasn't super bearish. You can see the daily trigger, the blue line below the weekly trigger, the yellow line, or the gold line, is a bearish trend. And you can see how Microsoft has just been selling all the way since April because you have that blue trigger below the weekly trigger. Now, if you flip this chart over in your head and imagine, or turn your head upside down for a second and imagine that this blue line, the daily trigger, is above the weekly trigger and price is moving up, you can see how bullish this trend would be. So the most important, very important aspect about the model is the daily trigger below the weekly trigger, or is it above? If it's below the weekly trigger, you're going to have bearish price action, like you could see these past 4 months in Microsoft. If it's above the weekly trigger, so if you just flip this graph over in your head, it's a very bullish trend. But if the monthly trigger was on top here, it would be even more bearish. Just look for a couple of more examples. Let's take a look at Amazon. Again, you could see the daily trigger below the gold trigger, and you can see how bearish the price movement has been all the way since then. If we put the hourly trigger on, yeah, so also if like price breaks through 2 triggers at once, or over here it basically broke through 3 triggers at once, that's going to be really bearish. All right, so you guys can see very clearly how when the blue trigger is below the gold trigger, it sets up a long-lasting bearish move for a stock. The last example that I'll give here, I'll show you guys the SPY, the S&P 500. Again, these triggers really do work, and you could see price right here. The blue trigger, it bear kisses off the gold trigger, so it doesn't really cross over, it rejects it right there. And you can see how bearish this move has been, because once the blue trigger is below the gold trigger, especially if it rejects like that, it sets up a really, really bearish move. And so that was a bunch of examples bearishly. I'm going to look for, there's not that many stocks that are bullish in this market, but I'll see if I can find one. All right, so this looks like a good example. Dollar Tree. So you could see, again, whatever happened here, I'm not so sure. I've no clue what this is. I've never even looked at this stock. But you can see how with the blue trigger, the daily trigger above the weekly trigger, all the way from February 3rd, or possibly even before that, look how bullish this move went. So Dollar Tree was able to move from 131, and this is a 6-month chart, but the blue trigger crossed way before. Price was probably a lot lower at that point, and it was able to move up all the way to 175. And with the blue trigger above the weekly trigger, price action is actually so bullish that even on dips like this, look how quickly that recovery was. Now again, I'm really not sure what happened here. So, but in general, this is the kind of price action you can expect. Once the blue trigger is above the weekly trigger, once the daily trigger is above the weekly trigger, you can expect really strong price action to the upside. And so that brings me to the main point here, which is GME. As you guys can see, we are 1 day away from a very important milestone in the stock. And that means, what I'm trying to say is, the daily trigger closed the day at 132.62, and the weekly trigger is at 132.92. And I showed you a bunch of bearish examples. There's even one here on GME right here, where the daily trigger rejected off the weekly right here. I'll even remove price so you can see it clearer. So you see that clean rejection right there, and then you can watch what happens afterwards to the price. It gets plummeted down from 140 to 80. So what we're about to see here, if you look at the daily velocity that we generated from today, so this was the print today, and this is a predictive terminal. So what that means is that it already predicts the velocity for tomorrow, which is this last print that you see. And over the day, it'll look something like this. But seeing this kind of print is a bullish sign in the stock, obviously. It means that there are a lot of buyers pushing the stock up. You could see how even from here, when price crossed the daily trigger to the upside, we generated this velocity print. And so the daily trigger was able to provide really nice support for the stock, pushed us above the weekly trigger right here. We were able to generate some really nice daily velocity, which led to this nice price spike. Came down a bit, but again, now that price is above these two very important triggers, the weekly and the daily trigger, we have really good support at these levels. So price hovered down here for a bit, and popped right back up, generated more velocity on, what was it, 2 days ago on Monday, more velocity with this trading day was today. Peaked at about 155.95 was the hourly close, and now we generated even higher velocity for tomorrow. And so what that means is that tomorrow, as long as price stays the same or even doesn't drop like too far down, that means that we're finally going to get this cross. And this is in my opinion, an even bigger cross than the 50-200 SMA. This is statistically and historically a really bullish cross in the model. There are hundreds of stocks, plenty of indexes that you can look through, and you'll see when the daily trigger crosses above the weekly trigger, it puts the stock historically in a 6 to 12 month bullish trend, which is really great news if you've been holding GME for a while. And what's even more important about this setup is you can see the monthly trigger. If that'll render, I'll take away the daily velocity. All right, so you can see that the monthly trigger is down here at 120. The weekly trigger is at 132. The perfect bullish orientation of triggers, if you want to see the stock trend bullishly for weeks and months and possibly even years, what you want to see is the monthly trigger at the bottom, the weekly trigger on top of that, the daily trigger on top of that, and the hourly trigger on top of that. When you get that trigger orientation, which tomorrow will most likely be that day, you can expect statistically for the stock to push into a bullish trend for a very lengthy period of time. And so I thought this was important, something that I wanted to share with the GME holders. I hope you find it useful, and good luck, everybody.